Welcome to A Physician's Guide to Retirement, the show where we explore what comes after the full schedule, the on-call nights, and the identity of being the doctor. For many physicians, retirement isn't a single decision. It's a transition. It can bring relief and freedom, but also unexpected questions. Who am I without the role? How do I stay connected to purpose and community? What happens to relationships, routines, and the sense of responsibility that shaped decades of practice? Each episode will sit down with physicians who are stepping away from clinical work, some gradually, some all at once, to hear what the shift really looks like. We'll talk about the practical side of leaving medicine, the emotional side of letting go, and the opportunities that open up when your time is finally your own. From part-time work and volunteering to second careers, creative pursuits, mentorship, and learning to rest without guilt. This is an honest conversation about closing one chapter and building the next. Whether you're years away, counting down the months, or already retired and recalibrating, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Imparato. Let's talk about the transition with purpose, with clarity, and with honesty. Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of How to Retire. I'm your host, Joe Imparato, the man who at one point failed retirement and trying to not do it again. And I have a recurring guest, Dr. Bill Thorwarth. Bill, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
What we want to talk about today, Bill, is the process of transitioning into retirement. And we both had kind of different ways in which we did this. So I'd like to start with you, and I'd like to have you go through the process that your group had for helping someone get into retirement mode.
Sure, I'm happy to discuss it. And I think from this perspective, there's really kind of two portions of the transition to retirement. One is the personal or individual transition. And then the second, as you mentioned, is how the group, the radiology group, sets up pathways for transition, for that appropriate transition, knowing that we're in a very different environment right now as far as numbers of radiologists who are employed as opposed to an independent practice. And also that the individuals have their own particular desire on how they might see their retirement transition. Somewhat like you, I retired twice. I retired from clinical practice in 2014 after 30 years with an independent diagnostic radiology group in North Carolina. And then that quote retirement was actually a transition to working for the American College of Radiology as their CEO, which I then did for 10 years. Touch on both of those transitions because they were a bit different. As far as the group dynamics, though, I think really an important thing to remember is that a group should try to prospectively set up guidelines by which their individual radiologists could potentially attempt to modify their work arrangements. I think we're all in a time where, with the workforce shortage, everybody wants to retain good radiologists in their practice, and they don't want to set up such that somebody who is willing and desires to continue to work and could contribute to the practice somehow gets excluded because of a hard and fast rule of you have to stay in the call pool or you have to be 100%. But I think it's best to take that arrangement or create what we had in our practice was a grid when nobody's request is on the table. So it doesn't look arbitrary or related to that specific individual. But yeah, our practice a long time ago, quite frankly, set up a grid by which someone who wanted to request change in other than full-time work, meaning, drop out of the call pool or potentially drop down to a certain percentage of working, or maybe do only work in one specific subspecialty. So you want to define each of those kind of modified work arrangements, and then you need to then define what's the implication of doing that. In other words, if you drop out of the call pool, what's the reduction in salary or bonuses? How might that be arranged? Is that just getting out of the weekend call pool or night call or all call type of thing? And I use the term call somewhat facetiously because it's really not call anymore. We know we work 24/7, so it's just those shifts. Anyway, so we created a grid with all those now to enter that grid or to make a request for some modification in work schedule. You ought to have a threshold of how long the person has to have been in the practice in order to make that request. other than extenuating circumstances like illness or family emergency or that type of thing. So you should try to define when a person's even eligible to make a request. Then the individual who made the request, when they bring that request to the group, it's up to the group whether they're willing to accept that or not. Because I think the top priority has to be in making sure that you're optimizing the group, basically achieving its mission of delivery of the care delivery that they're asked to do.
So some groups I recall had age limits. So at age 60, for example, you automatically were taken off the call schedule. Did your group have anything like that where there was a certain point where your load
Great
was
question,
lessened
and an
just
important one
purely
to be
by
addressed.
the length of
Our
time you were
group
with the
had,
group
in our
or
employment
by
agreement, so
age?
all radiologists signed and agreed to this, and this is what made it legally acceptable relative to age discrimination rules. We had in our contract that following age 65, you continued to work at the will of the group. And so again, that left the group as in charge. So an individual who might want to continue to take call, and either for financial reasons or they like to have the next day off or whatever the circumstance might be. So our definition of a kind of an abrupt change for all radiologists was once you hit 65, you had to your work was at the will of the group. You could continue as a full-time partner, or you could accept, or you could request one of these setups as defined by the grid. So no, good question, and one that should be addressed proactively. And maybe something like you're describing. We didn't feel like we could really mandate someone go out of call at a given age simply because maybe it still suited their lifestyle and their financial needs, et cetera. So, but we did say that after 65, to optimize the group's ability to perform its either contractual or community requirements, that's where the various stages were set up.
Yeah. Now it's interesting because, as you mentioned at the beginning, most radiology or many radiology groups are now employed by a hospital system. And so now you fall under kind of this large corporate umbrella, which has it has their own setup in terms of rules and requirements. So there, typically, as I recall, when I transitioned out of clinical practice, my contract, you were required to give a certain amount of time for notice. And I was able to, because of family circumstances, I was able to shorten that by a few months. It behooves everybody to really know what the corporate requirements are if you decide you want to retire, because some of them can be as long as 6 months. That you have to give 6 months notice. And again, exceptions can be made, but usually it's because of illness or extenuating family circumstances. But it's very different than it was in a private practice where you can scale back. If the group can tolerate it, you don't have to just quit or retire, but you can scale back. You can go part time. There are generally a lot more options that in the corporate environment doesn't always fit the needs of the group. The other thing is I find that a lot of the practices that are owned by health systems tend to run very, very tight ship. So you don't, so basically when somebody goes on vacation, for example, you're short staffed. I mean, you're very hard to make that transition knowing that they are going to have to replace you hopefully by the time you leave.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it
So
gets tricky.
this goes back even kind of one step back for the group. That is, if you are in the process of negotiating an arrangement between your practice, maybe it was an independent practice, and you've elected to either become employed by a hospital or healthcare system or investment group, you need to look very carefully at the provisions that are in there. So the more autonomy your group can maintain over personnel, scheduling, coverage, those types of things in that contract with whomever your group's going to be working for, you're better off. If you end up being all individual employees, individual radiologist employees in that practice, or radiation oncologist employees in that to that healthcare system, then you have much less leverage, you have much less control, and like you say, then you just fall into the bucket of like any other employee for that organization, as far as your potential options and notice requirements and those types of things.
So, and then you transitioned, and I'll tell my story, which is parallels yours. But you went then into the true corporate world when you went to the ACR. So, talk about that transition, because
Yeah,
that's
and
another
honestly, as far as
interesting
personally,
change
probably the
that
toughest
occurs at that
challenge I
level.
had in making that transition was I ready to be finished practicing clinical diagnostic radiology, diagnostic and interventional radiology. I mean, I loved what I did every day, and so likewise was I ready to move. You know what I mean? The hospital's headquarters were in Reston, Virginia. I was in North Carolina. There was no way to bridge those two, and I knew kind of right away that I couldn't do the job and really, I think, accept the responsibilities of being CEO for the college, and then try to dabble part time of doing some interventional cases, in the DC area, for instance. So that was the first and major consideration in that transition. But I think I was ready. I enjoyed my clinical work to the last day, but this was kind of a new opportunity and adventure, and the opportunity to work with great staff folks that I'd worked with as a volunteer for decades. So that, as I say, was a real change. The flip side was I knew also that this was going to be a 24/7 job. There was, when I was in clinical practice, like most radiology groups, we had reasonably abundant time off, and that time was mine to either allocate to volunteer work or to go do recreational stuff or family trips and that type of thing. So yeah, that was a real major part of that decision, but one that I was very happy to make and don't regret for a minute.
Yeah, it's interesting. So my transition, my group was taken over by a health system and just did not really fit my style anymore. So I left there, and I did some locums in between, which I'd covered one friend's practice who had retired, and then I covered another practice that was just starting up, kind of as I was intending to slow down and fully retire. And then I always make the joke that I failed retirement because a friend of mine talked to me about joining what was at that time AIM Specialty Health, which is the insurance industry, as a pre-authorization reviews. And I'm sure many of the physicians hearing this will be hissing and booing for having joined the evil empire. And initially, I was just going to do it for 2 years until I turned 65 and went on Medicare. But next thing I know, 9 years had passed, and I was the manager of oncology operations for 7 of those 9 years. And so for me, the next step of transitioning to what I think is going to be true retirement was kind of interesting because I enjoyed the job. I was able to work from home. It was very good salary and not overwhelming in terms of time requirements or the amount of work that I had to do. But I could tell that I was becoming tired. That the all of the corporate changes that occurring right now, not just in that industry, but in every industry, the turmoil was becoming harder and harder for me to both accept and to adapt. And so I made the decision, and it took me close to a year to really come to the conclusion that, maybe it was time for me to step down. There was a young woman who had been my team lead for almost a year. She clearly was qualified to, take over my position. And I finally decided it was time for me to leave on my terms versus waiting until they wanted to throw me out. So I think that's one of the aspects we don't always talk about is people are very afraid of that transition to retirement, even when, and we'll take finances out of the picture for the moment. So even those people who have, more money than God, there's a fear of losing your identity, losing your reason for getting up in the morning. And I think that's one of the things I want to discuss with you. So you obviously you had a full career. So, but when that day came and all of a sudden you didn't have to worry about getting calls from the ACR and nobody needed you, how did you adapt to that transition? How did you fill your day?
Well, I'll say as far as the timing and how much notice you give, my contract with the ACR was initially a 5-year contract, and approximately 3.5 to 4 years into that, discussed with the board leadership, whether they'd want me to continue beyond that, which they had requested that I do, and then I was considering, okay, do I extend for 3 more years or 5 more years? And so you go through all the pluses and minuses, and you create your pros and cons list and elected to stay for 5 more years. But about in that second 5-year term, COVID came along. We went to remote working. It was a very different set of circumstances. We got through that very smoothly. Honestly, the college has done a great job converting to remote working. But it was a bit of a different job because the day-to-day personal interactions in the hallway or lunchroom or whatever, just weren't there. So I felt pretty confident as I got about year 3 into that, and by that time we were just coming out of COVID, that at the end of that 5-year term I was going to be ready, and gave the board notice so that they could do an appropriate search for my replacement, which they very successfully did with Dr. Dean Smethurman in that role now. But so that gave me a fair amount of time to sort of mentally prepare for that, that completion of that. It stayed intense. I was able to attend or be the CEO for the centennial meeting for the college, and then about 2 months thereafter, and Dana to actually signed on to sort of do some communication back and forth and transition planning. So she and I, in essence, somewhat overlapped. I, stayed in full responsibility, but it gave her kind of an on ramp. And then likewise, when she took over July 1st, they kept me on in a very kind of low compensated as needed contact for about 2 or 3 months as well. So it actually worked. That transition worked pretty smoothly. And as far as the mental adjustment, honestly, when people ask me July 2nd, how long is it going to take you to retire? And I honestly said about 15 minutes because it had all been pretty well orchestrated. I was confident that it was time for me, and quite frankly, I think probably best for the college to get new leadership as well. And so I think it's individual. I will say that when my first retirement, when I left clinical practice, there was somewhat of a longing and missing out on the clinical care and the patient interactions. I did mostly interventional radiology, and you as radiation oncologist, I'm sure I had the same thing. The professional satisfaction of that, of a great case and success, and sometimes some things that were much more challenging. But no, I will say that again, and then maybe this is my personality too. When the time would come, I had adjusted psychologically, I guess, to proceed with that. But I think it's something that people really have to address because, like you say, if your identity is that what 30, 40, or sometimes more years of a specific profession, it sometimes is, I think not just sometimes, but often hard to step away.
So again, day one of retiring, like how how did you find filling your day? Is like what and then I have an ulterior motive asking you this because it's been interesting for me, but I'm curious how you made the change because I recall as a side, I remember when I was president of the American Cancer Society for the state of Illinois, and similarly when I was chief of staff at Lake Forest Hospital, and those terms just ended. That was a strange transition in itself because you're getting calls, you're getting emails, you're getting texts, you're getting contacted, and then your term is up, and all of a sudden phone doesn't ring, no more emails, no, and it's kind of strange. And so I that was like one of the concerns I had when I finally decided to retire. Come that next day, where you know what's going to get me out of bed?
Well, I do think,
Like,
and I think it's
what do I
important to do
do?
some planning. My wife Nancy and I had for several months, and actually probably close to a year beforehand, started planning activities. We have, 4 children and 11 grandchildren spread around us, so there was plenty of opportunity there. But we actually, started looking at traveling that we had intended to do and had not had the opportunity to do during a working career. I think I was not a guy who accumulated a lot of hobbies. So I didn't have an old car to go work on, or and my athletics had been short circuited by a couple of hamstring tears and a right ACL reconstruction. So my thoughts of getting back to tennis, which I played for a long time, didn't really materialize either. But we had put together about a probably 4 to 6 month plan of stuff to do, if you know what I mean. And also, we just honestly, more than anything, I think, as far as total time, just enjoyed having our time and the flexibility to, at a moment's notice, say, oh, well, let's, drive over to Hilton Head, or let's drive up to Charlotte for a couple of days, or go visit some friends up in the North Carolina mountains. That flexibility really, I think, made it very easy to feel like I wasn't leaving something behind.
Yeah, and that was exactly what I was hoping you were going to say because the point I want to make is, y- you know, we talk about transitioning out of work, and so you're planning how you're going to scale down and how you're going to leave. But it's very important to be at the same time planning the next phase of your life. How are you going to be dealing with retirement? So for me, it was kind of interesting, and some of it was a little fortuitous happenstance. But I got invited to speak at this company that talks about it basically helps small startup companies. The first meeting was genetics companies. The second meeting was companies that create medical devices, and speak to them about how insurance looks at new technology and new tests and how they determine what they reimburse and what they cover, what they don't. So I started doing a little bit of that, and then also I had previously been on the faculty of one of the medical schools, and I was able to get back on the faculty to do a little bit of teaching. And again, my goal always was I didn't want another full time job. I didn't want to fail yet a second time. But it's nice to have some of these little things to look forward to. I say, oh, next Wednesday I'm going to go and give a talk at the med school for a couple hours. A lot of some of my other colleagues who have retired, a lot of them are into golf, so they'll play golf, 3 4 times a week, which for me would be like a death sentence. I am not an avid golfer, so or once a week, 9 holes, and I can kind of manage that. But it is I think a lot of people don't think about that next step, whether it be travel or hobbies or other activities, and I think it's really important to have that be
Yeah,
integrated into
couldn't agree with you
your
more. And
process.
I think, for instance, reading for enjoyment as opposed to reading, medical literature, or when I was in, CPT coding manuals or those kinds of things and I do think that you have to be intentional about looking for those opportunities, because you end up sitting around and getting bored and just sort of saying, what am I doing here? I think that that's a real possibility. But I do think that if you take some time prior to that day, retirement day, and give us some thought of what are the things you feel like you've been missing out on potentially, and would like to go catch up with. Yeah, that's. But I will say that having
Mhm.
control of time, to me, is the absolute major benefit of being retired. That you're not on somebody else's schedule. You look at your calendar and it's
Yeah.
chock full of calls from 7:30 in the morning till 5:30 or 8 o'clock in the evening. Do you know what I mean? Or somebody calling you and saying, we want you on this in an hour. Not having that type of confinement has really been the major benefit. But you do want to take the time to think about how you'd like to fill that time, because there is a lot of time as you find out once you retire.
Although it is funny because now it's granted only been 3 months, but uh, one of the comments I've made to my colleagues who are still working is I said I am shocked as to how quickly the day goes by. So you do the things you want to do, and the next thing you know, it's dinner time. Your day is gone, and there have been several days where I sit there and go, how did I do this when I was working? Like, how did I get all this done? So it is an interesting transition, and like you have 11 grandkids. I only have three, and I was complaining to my daughter once, about colleagues like you who have 11, and she looks at me, she goes, "Well, maybe you should have had more children," So it's just her and my son. So I'm gonna have my
Yeah,
son
yeah. My
has to kick it
youngest
into high
really
gear
helped out.
to
They
help
had
me
five,
catch up to
so they
everybody.
really.
Oh wow, yeah, there we go. But and that's another thing is having time with my grandkids. They live. I'm lucky they live very close by, and so during the summer when they're off of school, sometimes we'll just take one for the day and we'll do a special project or do a special activity that they really like, and that's been wonderful to be able to actually do that and not have to plan the day off and then the weather happens to be bad because the weather's bad today, then we'll just do it tomorrow, it doesn't matter. So I think that's and I say this because I know there are people out there who are contemplating retirement and are afraid of what's going to happen when they don't have a job to get up for. And you pointed out, and I pointed out, there will be things. There are things there. And you talked about reading. For God's sake, I used to read so much, and then with work and practice and everything else and medical literature, I stopped. And now it's being able to restart and actually read for pleasure is has been a great enjoyment. And it sounds like such a small thing, but it really is true.
But well, I'd like to return, if I may, for just a minute, though, to get back to the concept of the group prospectively creating a system by which people can work in various stages. Obviously, you can't have it willy nilly. Do you know what I mean? And you also can't have it appear arbitrary that this person got to go 80%, but I didn't get to go 80%. Why? And you need to set those parameters transparently, with buy-in from the whole group, with an agreement. And then you have to have a certain level. If someone's working below, first of all, I'm presuming that whoever continues to work is still doing a good job and still intending on keeping up, and they're not just hanging on because they want a paycheck. Do you know what I mean? You have to be the group has to be very wary of that. But if you can set it up so that people do have that flexibility, you do extend people's enjoyable working careers. And as I say, particularly in these days of workforce shortage, and you're trying to do your best to retain good talent, that's a working group that can really help your group make sure they're able to uh, maintain the full coverage responsibilities that they have.
Yeah, it's important. I think one of the lessons is you want to. in a perfect world, you want to retire without leaving, bad blood behind or burning any bridges or anything else. And I think that's important too, because sometimes people may just, want to say, that's it, I've had enough, I'm done. And you leave everybody else in the lurch. And, it really is not the right way to do it. So I think that's another really important part. And you make a really good point, Bill. I mean, you want to leave
Sure.
on the best terms
Yeah.
you possibly can.
Yeah,
That
and
really is
attempt to
important.
ensure that our group actually had, we had a severance arrangement. If you worked for the practice for more than 15 years, you were eligible for this severance. And it was not an insubstantial amount of money. They figure they're going to continue to collect for billings of work you've done after you retired. So they came up with an appropriate number there. But you were only eligible for that if you gave sufficient notice. So you couldn't just walk and leave the group in an entanglement. If that happened, then that severance went back to the group, and at least while they were trying to recoup your replacement, everybody else was being appropriately increased in their compensation for, like you as you describe it, covering that left in a lurch.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for your time. I think this has been great. I think it's important for everybody out there who is contemplating retirement to make sure you're looking at not only the steps up to retirement, but also the steps after retirement, because it is really a process and it is really a transition. But overall, I think it's a great one, and certainly again, it's only been 3 months, but I have no regrets so far. So,
Great to hear.
yeah, thank you. Thank you again, Bill. And thanks all of you for listening, and keep in touch for the next podcast. Thank you all.
My pleasure. Joe, if I may, I'll put in a plug for the prior podcast we did about the financial planning side, which you mentioned briefly. If you all, any listener listens to this and hasn't
Yeah.
listened to that one, I would recommend it because I think there's some good
Yeah.
advice in
And,
there
and the
as well.
same thing with the transition to Medicare, which is a lot harder than you would think. So absolutely listen to both of those before you do anything else. So thank you, Bill. That's a very good point. All right. Thanks all. Take care. Bye-bye. As we wrap up today's episode, remember, retirement in medicine isn't just an ending. It's a handoff, a chance to step back from the pace of clinical life while carrying forward what matters most: your values, your relationships, and the parts of you that exist beyond the white coat. If this conversation resonated, share it with a colleague who's starting to think about what's next, and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have a story, a question, or a topic you'd like us to explore, send it our way. We'd love to include your voice. Until next time, take care of yourself the same way you always cared for others.